Good morning, and we're back here. I'm Dan Winter, fractalfield.com. This is another video in the series, The Interstellar History and the Purpose and Outcome for Humanity and the Human Species of Earth in the context of interstellar history. Where is the happily ever after? In the previous two videos on this series, one was on the physics and electrical engineering of the science of ascension, and the last video we did in this YouTube channel on the purpose of humans in ET history was just an intro, and we reviewed the science as a prerequisite for understanding extraterrestrial history. The three parts of the science we reviewed: how longitudinal wave propagation has to go through the solid points in the compressional nodal array, which are dodecafractal, and that only those magnetic line cross points enable the transverse to interchange inertia with the longitudinal component, sometimes incorrectly called scalar or torsional. And so those cross points, nodes in that fractal Y galaxies as well as Earth, all the nodes are pent-dodeca, golden ratios, because that's the only place where the compression wave nodes exchange information back with the transverse and give us access to DNA radio, as it were. Second part of the science we reviewed was the physics of how the pyramids would attract charge, because as a piezoelectric hummer, the harmonic content of the pyramid would then become more charge implosive, amplifying the voltage difference between the point in the sky and a good ground. And by the power spectra being implosive or conjugate, it would cohere charge from the vacuum, literally a zero-point energy device, the hummer, the pyramids, and that they had to be placed at this nodal array, the Earth grid dodeca ecosa fractal, in order for the global distribution of wireless energy to be efficient, the missing piece to Tesla, as it were. And finally, we then used that as a way to introduce the physics of how portals work, stargates. For example, in Andrew Basiago's many useful descriptions of his time travel work, late 60s, early 70s, he describes these arcs that are creating a charge cocoon, literally a charge membrane, very much like in the movie Stargate, which was, by the way, a hypercube of O'Fana-Minokian letters, which is the way you angle the implosion of charge to make that membrane, and not unlike the phase conjugate dielectric coating of Nostradamus's scrying cup or the obsidian mirror of the way the Olmec communicated with ancestors, that phase conjugate mirror is the physics of that interdimensional, as it were, communication. So the point was that the arcs that Andrew Basiago so nicely describes, fitting the movie Stargate quite well, except he's describing real historical experiments in time travel and plasma projection, portals as it were, that is a plasma array that at that point becomes implosively compressive, and implodes, projects a very coherent longitudinal wave which you can ride. For example, you can lucid dream better inside the Therify. We have testimonials. We know why. Therify.net, as Maya reported, because a phase conjugate implosive pinecone kissing noses projective plasma array better enables your aura, the charge cocoon around your body, the plasma bubble, as it were, the ba from the ka, as we and the Egyptians would say, that enabling that to propagate coherently into the longitudinal, what the Pleiadians say, becoming 5D from 3D, lucid dreaming enabled, and enabling passing memory through death, enabling communication with ancestors, enabling power transmission at a distance without wires. All that is longitudinal interferometry. And so these stargates are literally places where you can be compressed, imploded, and propelled through the speed of light. And we know, it's well known, for example, the gravity waves, which we now know are a major component longitudinal EMF, are faster than light. And we know, as Raymond Chow measured, that the primary speed of the faster than light velocities, as measured in physics by Professor Raymond Chow, is approaching 1.618, which is golden ratio times the speed of light, literally proving my theory of gravity, that is, that the propulsions faster than light going out through the Planck threshold have to be at multiples of golden ratio times the speed of light in order to phase conjugate, and the drain through that hole of charge at the Planck threshold, named the gravity, which is why you're literally calling the pyramid Hummer a gravity diode, that then enables that superluminal transmission of information energy, and then when in that nodal array, if there's another node in the array which has identical frequency conditions, the receiver, as it were, for the Stargate, and they need to be placed at the nodes in this array, etc., etc. So we started to talk about the physics of what a Stargate is, and I suggested that's necessary to understand the history, the extraterrestrial history of humans on Earth, which is where we're going in this conversation. Finally, in the intro section, I forgot to mention the link where I put the graphics from the famous book 2/3 by David Myers and David Percy, which is here, goldenmean.info/Babylon, B-A-B-A-L-O-N, in which they depicted quite well. So here you have me, I'm nutate precessing this famous gyroscope. And if I get it right, then as I nutate precess the gyroscope, I can increase the speed of the spin. I literally pump from the long wave, speeding up the short wave. And that phase relationship, which we say is disciplined and ultimately conjugate, is the reason why planetary spins must be embeddable, the perfection of entanglement, which is perfected in golden ratio conjugation, so that the local spin must be embeddable in zodiacal spin, so that the charge implosion can cascade from the long wave to the short wave, and that stabilizes gravity and atmosphere. And that's not just a metaphor, that's in the physics of why pyramids are placed at the tetrahedral latitudes of planets, because you got to grab a hold of the spin rate and phase lock embed the local spin with the zodiacal spin accurately to stabilize gravity and therefore atmosphere. And it's widely reported in that early literature, if you look, that one of the functions of the pyramids was literally stabilizing atmosphere, because that was one of the details in stabilizing life on planets, as Enki reports, that, you know, if the planet's too big, the gravity is too great, you can have an atmosphere, but you can't have life. And if the planet's too little, the atmosphere goes away and you can't have life. So there's a little tightrope there on the size of the planet that can efficiently maintain life. And to widen the spectra of that tightrope of the amount of gravity on a planet, just enough to have life, but not enough to kill the life, and just enough to keep atmosphere, and that tightrope is massaged by the dolmenic function, which, remember, when Lovelock wrote the software for the Gaia hypothesis into Sim Earth, he said, well, you place these dolmen and accelerates the evolution of consciousness on planets. Well, actually, what it does is accelerate the projection of the nodal array, the key word being array, fractal array, enabling communication with what we call DNA radio, and therefore collective unconscious, and therefore survival memory library. So this is a little background to the conversation we're about to have now, which is a short history of time. I mean, a short history of humans in the galaxy, with hopefully the emphasis being on the word short, and emphasis being on where is the happily ever after. So the notes for this conversation, I will put at the top of the main lecture, the main article, which is the history of this lecture, which is fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. So all the resources for this conversation will be at that article, which is our primary ET history article on the web. And the section which is devoted to the lecture notes from this article will be labeled Inceptive Cyborg. Now why am I calling this lecture the Inceptive Cyborg lecture? And it's what I consider a bit of a funny story, that when we were studying the Inceptive Cyborg effect, now I'm going to this section of this lecture to where I discuss the Inceptive Cyborg effect at goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. And we were looking at the Acambaro figurines. Now remember, these are famous in Mexico, and they're clay and therefore high dielectric material, therefore susceptible to capacitive coupling, which is the physics of the Inceptive Cyborg effect. And the Inceptive Cyborg effect, as Francis Farrelly, who was the partner of Arthur Young, who was a very good friend of mine, invented the Bell helicopter. I stayed in his place and enjoyed his Rolls-Royce collection. And so Francis Fairley and Arthur Young measured this phenomenon that if you take a fluted neck, in this case I think it was an axolotl, Acambaro clay figurine, and you put it next to the cage of a real axolotl, within a certain period of time, and sometimes they actually connected a wire between the cage and the clay figure, which is, again, charge coupling, that eventually the axolotl, the living axolotl, would develop a fluted neck, or in some cases I think it was a fluted ear, that the actual fold in the shape of the statue would affect the animal, literally, really, measurably, and replicably. Now, you say, oh, that's witchcraft. The church would call that evil. No, it's the physics of capacitive coupling. It's literally morphic resonance measured. Well, now, okay, but why do they call this the inceptive cyborg effect? Well, again, whether you call this funny or not, the argument over the Acambaro figurines in Mexico was long because they depicted dinosaurs in the same room, in the same environment as humans repeatedly, and of course this caused a great uproar among the religious fundamentalists because this means God created. Well, there's much evidence that the Mayans and other cultures knew about dinosaurs, but our friend Michael Helias, who I give credit for this conversation, he said, well, actually what happened was, and there are pictures here where they show human males with very large penises. And Michael Helias explained that, now this may strain credulity, but later in the context of our conversation, I'm not sure. They said that Enki, who at that time, his partner, Thoth, Hermes, Nudimud, Nudimud was Enki's, one of his many other names, like other's name was Ea, which means for whom Earth was named. And his partner Thoth, Hermes, who was later Quetzalcoatl Viracocha, their agenda, and this is the theme of this lecture, is these ETs always have agendas. Their agenda at that point was that since Enki's cloning cooking pot, and he was hired as a cloner, this is Nudimud, and remember, his Draco-Uru culture had been using cloning as the only legal means of replication for thousands of years, and the question is, did they lose ensoulment and long-term memory? That's where we're going with the conversation. But the little sort of funny story here is that purportedly, Enki used this technique that he had humans he literally massaged the field of human males to have larger penises. This might seem obscene, but actually this is, we believe, partially a true story. His agenda was to oversex the humans in order to make them harder to enslave. Have you ever wondered why humans are oversexed? I thought that's one of the most creative answers I ever heard. And now, remember that Enki was in rebellion against his father from the Draco-Anu family, who wanted the humans, the Takadama, which means Takadama. Adama means slave, or red-blooded slave, because we had iron in our blood. Tak means Orion, Takadama, the original Adam and Eve, the humans. He wanted his Takadama to... Enki wanted the humans to have some redeeming social value, the theme of this lecture, and he didn't want them to be just slaves and snack food for the Draco. And another reason I'm giving this lecture is I don't want you to be just slaves and snack food for Draco, so maybe we need to understand the value of humans in the interstellar conversation. And indeed, many recent sources, have concluded that the slave trade remains a huge problem. For example, in the Interstellar, like Robert Woods said, William Tompkins, one of his primary issues with the way the extraterrestrials enacted with humans was the slave trade. And we're told that the Nazis, after they took over the South Pole with their Haunebu, Mercury implosive projection gravity, when they wanted a bit of territory on the moon and Mars, they had to trade for it literally with slaves. And so, for example, Elon Musk thinking, oh, well, you just fly to Mars and take over some real estate. No. And many sources said even when the humans, the NASA landed on the moon, you had these reptilians, whom I think were probably Kingu, sitting around the edge of the crater saying, okay, you can play here for a little bit, but You don't come back, or else. And we need a little more context for that. And this is not speculation. This has been confirmed by multiple sources, which we're going to be discussing here. And if you listen to the various authors in the secret space program conversation on Gaia TV, again, the good ones I think are Randy Kramer, Jason Rice, Robert Woods. I don't have so much confidence in Corey Goode. And David Wilcock thinks the blue sphere beings doesn't even know they're Andromedan, who were blue, and actually they're light blue when young and darker blue when older. We're going to talk about that, and probably the origins of Krishna myth. So the main weakness of those sources of information is lack of understanding of science, and that's part of what we want to include in this conversation. Okay, so then back to what are our sources, the biggest sources for this conversation. Remember, scientists today are absolutely clear. No scientist would argue with billions of stars out there. There's at least many millions, probably billions of inhabited star systems. Nobody does. And recent calculations have concluded there's got to be dozens of contactable intelligent species. So no scientist even denies that anymore. So obviously when you have hundreds of sources on this planet claiming to be talking to ETs, it doesn't make sense to say they're all fools. No, what makes sense is you interview every single one of those sources about extraterrestrials and you compare and check their stories and you see what fits together. Now that's mostly my source. I knew Alex Collier, I knew Robert Morning Sky, I knew Ghost Wolf, I knew I was with the Hopi, I knew Marciniak with the Pleiadians, many sources. And then I had some personal telepathic contact with Phaseus and Morne, mostly Phaseus, the Andromedan mystic, thanks to being introduced to them by Alex Collier, and then re-encountering them thanks to Med, who was our major Pleiadian source. In fact, so I'm going to review some of those sources right now. So well, that's the end of the conversation. So two major sources of the Pleiadian information, Med, who's the original contactee with the Pleiadians and Andromedans, and I'm grateful for Med's friendship and for much input, and I want to be careful to respect our wonderful friends in this regard. We worked with Med for years. Mediatormedias.wordpress.com, and the specific article of many of Med's original communications with the Pleiadians and many other species that we'll be mentioning today in particular is Action 5, Lifting the Veil, in the English section on Med's website, which is Interstellar Wars and Their Impact. Now, secondary source on this Pleiadian information is Gosha, the Cosmic Agency YouTube channel, who met the Pleiadians, specifically mostly Swaru, through Med, and who has now created a wave of videos of our communication with Swaru, Teget and Pleiadian, who says was reincarnated many times. I'd call some of that a psychic break, but so many of her films sadly completely lack science, but are very colorful, and some of them are useful. The lack of science is sad, and also another part of what we want to understand here is all of these sources have agendas, and humans need to begin to learn what those agendas are if we're to become even knowledgeable and have any empowerment in interstellar circles, literally galactic history. So I mentioned Alex Collier, alexcollier.org, who was a wonderful friend there for a while when I lived outside of Boulder in Colorado. We were not far from each other, and it was through him that I met Morne Visayas of the Andromedans and began to learn of that story. So that's an earlier source. This is the Galactic History Inceptive Cyborg article, which I will place these links to all these sources at the top of fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. Note that we also mentioned the Hopi Morning Sky Guardians of the Grail book and articles. The link will be there, the Peshmatan, goldenindent.info/Peshmatan. And then Vincent Bridges' story of the Galactic Core Cultures. So that's the major article we'll be using. Now let's see if there's any other major. Okay, so where do we begin? if we do all prequel, when do we get to the meat of the matter? Well, when I was living in near Phoenix. It was wonderful to be kind of adopted by the founders of A Flower of Life there, Lisa Royale and Ron Holt. So at that time, we used to have lunch frequently, and Lisa Royale would, of course, tell us about her work, including her book, Prism of Lyra, which is, you would probably call it channel material, in which she very colorfully tells the story of a humanoid diaspora from the Lyra part of the galaxy, Lyra's star system. And interestingly, years later now, multiple Pleiadian sources have described origins of humanity there as well. And I refer both to Med and Gosha, the links I provided. Now, remember, as we do this, I've also been heavily influenced by Anton Parks, fractalfield.com/Zeitlin, who has a very exquisitely detailed history of basically Enki, Enlil, Anunnaki, Draco, Uru, Ages of Uras family, and who, like every indigenous culture practically on the planet, the Maori, the Japanese, the Cherokee, they all say, where did our species come from? They point and say, Pleiades. They're all clear about that. There's no ambiguity. And so Anton Parks, I think correctly, says, well, yes, Enki, later called Osiris, Ea, wakes up in a cloning cooking pot in Pleiades, and his family is running from a female-dominated, and now we know the Pleiadians are female-dominated. Now, our present Pleiadian sources say, oh, well, it's much more gentle than the patriarchy of the humans, but there are some question marks there we'll get to. Point is that the Anton Parks material, sadly, does not go back to the big enough picture. Where did this conflict begin? And notably and importantly, we need to see here that one of the symptoms, and this is going to become a theme of these conversations, one of the symptoms of loss of what you would call ensoulment, which now we know the physics, this means your DNA does not implode with bliss and you do not propagate a coherent longitudinal wave, therefore you do not take memory through death and do not lucid dream well, what they call being 5D. It means that more axes of charge symmetry have made implosive compression possible, which connects you with that longitudinal array, which gives you leverage on tornadoes, among other things. So ensoulment here needs to have a lot of meaning to electrical engineers. And ultimately, and this is, I can't emphasize this enough, if and when our scientists and electrical engineers and biophysicists and genetic engineers know what it means electrically to be ensouled, then we can decide what vaccines don't wipe out the soul of children. So we're going to need to know. And that issue has become urgent today. We say, oh, is all engineering bad? Is all genetic engineering bad? Are all vaccines bad? Are they all unspiritual? No. There can be some very useful situations where you might need a vaccine and you might need some genetic engineering. But if you don't know what having a soul is as an electrical engineer, then you can't make the decision intelligently. And that's the problem. That's why we're here. So, and I will review, as I have many times, goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. When you have the right charge conditions, hint sacred space, hint excellent live food nutrition, hint learning how to meditate, hint brainwaves with golden ratio, the phonon harmonics of your spine liquid pump kundalini and your brainwaves reach golden ratio, flameinmind.com, and suddenly your DNA recursively braid implodes and squirts out a coherent longitudinal array called having a soul. So, charge radiance, bliss, is always preceded by charge implosion, what you would call cohering the vacuum for zero-point energy, which is exactly what human bliss is, and exactly the physics, and I mean physics, of watching a shaman steer a tornado. He embeds in that tornado, beautiful article on that, goldenmean.info/dowsing. So you get leverage on the centripetal force of that array simply by achieving the critical mass of charge implosion, So the very physics of being able to see at a distance, for example, Nostradamus looking into his water scrying cup with the black phase conjugate mirror coating on the bottom, or Andrew Basiago getting into what he called a chronovisor, which we now know is a longitudinal compression charge array, and being able to project that hologram for time travel. Well, when Nostradamus was looking at the future, he was almost always weeping with empathy, compassion for those whom he saw in pain. And that compassion, which is identical with charge compression, non-destructive charge compression, charge implosion, is what compassion is. That was creating the electrical suction that drew the future to his implosive tornado center called vision. So the skill to be able to have compassion for what you're seeing creates the centripetal force. And as we famously discussed at goldenmean.info/dowsing, where we show the pictures of the physics of how shamans steer tornadoes, the shaman says, I'm eating the anger, the chucha, of that tornado. What he means is, I'm feeling its pain. Well, what is the pain of that tornado? Exactly the only physics of what your pain ever is where fractality is bleeding charge due to lack of the symmetry of implosive compression. That's a definition of pain. That's why when you restore centripetal electrical compression, Verify.net is one of the first things we learned how to do was control pain, especially localized pain, because we restored compression. So when you feel the pain, you're feeling, for example, the tornado, when it's passing over a sacred church, is gaining charge inertia and it's happy. But if the tornado passes over a metal trailer park where the dielectric is all wrong, the tornado feels its charge bleeding and it feels the pain. Haven't got time for the pain. And destroys the metal trailer park and leaves the sacred stone church circle untouched, because the metal trailer park is pain by definition, because its charge distribution efficiency prevented. That's the definition of pain. So of course the tornado destroys the metal trailer park and leaves the sacred church, because the church feels like part of its body. The metal trailer park feels like a painful scab that won't heal. And so when humans put metal cities with electric on the surface of the planet, of course the planet feels that as pain, because it's a scab that won't heal, because its charge distribution prevented the wrong dielectric constant. That's why biologic architecture or death, another corollary to the get fractal or get dead. So, have we been distracted from our main story? So early on in this history, there were a large number, just like probably 1,000, but there's a very large number of beautifully evolving humanoids, human cultures, in the Lyra and Vega sector. And they were invaded by, at a critical point in history, and this is the turning point, the beginning of what we call the Orion Wars, or Wars of Expansion, as the Pleiadians call them. Extremely destructive, what you would say, Draco, Uru, Reptilian, Kingu, and there are many branches of the Uras, Uru Asa LM, the Uru family of Draco, many branches of the family. And the high ones today are actually allies, Alpha Draco, for example. So it isn't a matter that they're all evil. It's just like, and this is, again, well, let's say, when we discovered why we needed wolves in Yellowstone Park, called Restore the Landscape of Fear. Now suddenly Yellowstone Park has green areas and everything's growing again. Before, wolves? No, because the herbivores were eating the hell out of the place, and you need a high-level predator. So let's not assume the Dracos are evil just because they eat humans. What's the relationship between the deer and the wolves? It's respect. What are the wolves were called keystone ecological turning points. Like you need wild sea otters, otherwise the kelp beds die, because the otters eat what's eating the kelp, etc., etc. There's all these, like the starfish is a keystone. It's a beautiful series on keystone species. So you need a keystone species to restore a landscape of fear. Well, you know, ecologists refer to the necessity of a landscape of fear. So why do humans assume that fear is evil? Well, actually, it's more about the respect that pushes, in this case, the deer, in their relationship with the wolves, to evolve into a condition of awareness. The deer become much sharper and more aware, and they evolve, and the humans as well. So let's not use the words good and evil too much in this conversation. Let's just have respect. So there was a humanoid diaspora, because the humans were actually defenseless at that point. And they migrated. The humans were largely, there was huge explosions, and many millions of humans died in that invasion of Lyra. It's well documented for those. And another aspect of this, you need to remember that another symptom of loss of ensoulment due to thousands of generations of cloning by replication by cloning, you know, when you have a kid with artificial insemination versus a kid that results with orgasm, there is a difference in ensoulment, and that difference is electrical, and it has to do with the plasma tornado of the moment of orgasm that connects you to ancestral memory. The reason why the ancient Grail Arthurian, for example, the parents and grandparents are present at the moment of conception, because it adds centripetal inertia to that moment of conception, and more ancestral interstellar memory comes through the vortex of birth, death, more soul force, as it were. And the critical need for humans to recognize what gives us a soul is going to be our surviving difference in the Star Wars, as it were. Look, you know, our technology, face it, it's crap. But our ability as humans to make something, remember, Pleiadian agenda. Oh, hint, hint, what was that? They have been replicating mechanically. Is there a problem with that? Yes. Do they need something from humans? Yes. Do they admit what they need from humans? No. Well, I'll tell you what it is, and we're about to get there. It has to do with the physics of what makes a soul in DNA, and that's the great Humpty Dumpty took a great fall. All the king's horses. The Dracos created royal lines, quote unquote, to babysit humans, if you beat Lawrence Gardner. They didn't like the sound of humans copulating. But actually, it was more than that. The genesis of the Grail Kings, the function of royal lines in original Draco Anunnaki history was to be a genetic cooking pot to fix Humpty Dumpty. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put that egg exquisitely back together again. How do you put an egg together? You make implosion in DNA, and you make an ensouled child. And guess what humans are good for in this story? It's the physics of how to make an ensouled child. One who has psychokinesis, lucid dreaming, takes memory through death, or rides the long wave Uncle Joe. And so the symptom of the disease here, of the Dracos, you know, cloning is the only legal way to replicate for 1,000,000 years. Loss of soul, what did that mean? It meant loss of long-term memory, loss of ability to take memory through death. So the Dracos don't remember their own history. And long-term memory is an indicator, and continuity of memory is critical. So when the Pleiadians are admitting that Swara was resynthesized from a computer aboard her starship after she was killed, you know, they call that a dramatic evolution. I call it a psychotic break. and you know, when people say we had a walk-in experience, the woo-woos, no. So I'm a psychologist. We know what to call that. We call that a psychotic break, because what is of value is continuity of memory. That's an indicator of ensoulment, and what was lost is long memory. So we are here right now having this conversation of what is long-term memory. And long-term memory for us is to remember the Star Wars, the Orion Wars, the Wars of Expansion, as the Pleiadians now call them. So, humanoid diaspora, galactic sector, there are 10 to 100,000 humanoid species in our quadrant of the galactic sector alone, according to multiple sources, including the Pleiadians. So lots of humanoids out there. So what is the value of the Earth humanoid? We're trying to get to say, well, what's our bargaining chip in this interstellar politics? You know, we can no longer ignore the ETs. Sorry, that's not possible anymore. You schizophrenic governments trying to hide ETs. It's too late. Actually, the Pleiadians and other cells, the treaty is up in about a year when they have to announce the presence of these ETs. So it's coming very soon. Okay? So you can't ignore all these ETs around messing with you. It's too late for that. No. So you're going to need to know your value in ET politics. What's your bargaining chip? Now, if you listen to Jason Rice, Robert Woods, and particularly Randy Kramer, they say, well, you know, humans, the technology is crap over here, but they like our beer, so you know we can sell beer. Well, I think it's true. We've been making beer for a while, and the beer of humans is well respected among ETs. And it's all about commerce for them. But we'd like to have a little sense of some value beyond beer making. And that's what I'm here to explain, is when you can teach the physics of how DNA makes a soul, propagates longitudinally coherently, starts to lucid dream, takes memory through death, steers tornadoes, gets psychokinetic, has leverage on longitudinal wave array, what the Aboriginals called dreamline, dreamtimes, songline, dreaming track. That's the moment when humans have some real bargaining chip. And I give you an example, a practical example. We know that after Eisenhower apparently, and Truman, they allowed the murdering of Secretary of State James Forrestal of the MJ-12 group because he was insisting on admitting that when Admiral Byrd got to the South Pole, the Nazis kicked the hell out of him. Well, you know, and he was helped by the reptilian Kingu who eat humans. And so rather than admit that, we lost the war to the Nazis, they said, we'll just we'll murder Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. Well, there had been supposedly a study at that time which said, our civilization would panic if we told them. So that was their excuse. So Eisenhower, and Laura Eisenhower, we had this conversation. He felt he had no choice. Well, it says, no, we're going to keep this secret. That secret is the root of a schizophrenic government whose secrets mean that democracy is not possible. The secret space program, the schizophrenia of the secrecy behind the secret space program, see Gaia.com, is proof that democracy will not be possible until the humans are educated and can vote intelligently. And the most important single function of government, like the USA, for example, is to tell their people what their political situation is, what their actual military situation is. And as long as you don't tell the humans of Earth their relationship with extraterrestrials, you have schizophrenic governments. So that lie, that huge lie that was propagated from the moment they decided to keep the secrets about the Nazi taking over the South Pole, propagates into exactly what Eisenhower predicted would be a catastrophe. That is the domination by a military-industrial complex, as we know. So, when the humanoid diaspora, at that time, they gathered into what now is called the Federation of Planets, UFOP, United Federation of Planets, which is big. And there are hundreds, probably thousands, of humanoids and many other intelligent civilizations represented in United Federation of Planets. But at the time that happened originally, they were losing. The Dracos were winning. Now it's actually different. But at that time, they were losing. So now, the challenge of our telling of this story, when the humanoid diaspora came, for humanoid diaspora then went to Pleiades, Sirius, etc., etc. It was literally human, and became the most common, one of the most common intelligent species among the stars are the humanoids. There are thousands of others, as Randy Kramer and Jason Rice correctly say. Since the humanoids were losing at that point, the Federation of Planets had to chase and track down the reptilian Draco group that was killing the humanoids and trying to dominate. And this is one of the fun parts in our story where we make a connection that has not already been made. Okay, so now I have just been telling you an interstellar history, which a big part of which is the Pleiadian source. I mentioned Med and Swaru and Gosha, and they both have a pretty good version of this story. But now I have also said that Anton Parks does a beautiful job of telling the history of Enki and Enlil and that particular branch of the Draco family. And we think that Anu, Enki's father, was basically Uru. It's called the Ages of Uras. And if you know what Uru means, it means more than the German word origins, ancient one. Uru means ancient Draco, ancient dragon blood, ancient Uru, as in Uru Asa LM, Uru, dragon, Asa, queen of, L, place of the phase shift, literally the Stargate, Jerusalem. And, you don't need to have a war over a Stargate that's broken. Let's learn how Stargates work. So we want to make a connection between someone like Anton Parks saying Enki woke up in a cloning cooking pot in Pleiades, and his family was on the run from a female-dominated question mark. Well, we now know what that female-dominated question mark was. It was a Pleiadian part of the Federation of Planets that was chasing the Draco Uru, hint, Enki's family. Now, another fun clue to that is when later on Swaru and the Pleiadians are saying, well, Lemuria was the good guys because it was Pleiadian, and Atlantis was the bad guys because it was reptilian Draco. Well, guess who started? Atlantis was named Thule, which means Tahuti, which means David, line of DWT. And so Thule, because it was started by Hermes, Thule, Tahuti, and that's the name of the royal lineage of all the Egyptian kings, Thutmose, because it's named for Enki's science officer, Thoth Tahuti. Ningishita is his Sumerian, his Anunnaki name. And so the reason the Pleiadians are calling Atlantis evil and reptilian and Pleiadians, because that was Enki's side of the family. That was the family of who they were chasing. So when the Pleiadians say what happened next, we now have context. We can plug the Anton Parks story into the Pleiadian story. And so here's now what everyone seems to agree on from at least the Pleiadian side of this, is that when a major branch of the troublemaking Draco Uru reptilian Kingu family came to Earth, they were regarded as a murderous invader, and they needed to be quarantined. And at that time, as now, the Federation of Planets came here with a huge starfleet, and a war erupted, which they called Tiamat War. And one major, in that war between the Draco reptilian and the Federation of Planets and Pleiadian and Andromedan on the other side, that Tiamat was blown up, and Mars lost its atmosphere, and much of the water of Tiamat fell on Earth, for example. And many details in Ahmed's version of the story, which is excellent and useful, I think. And point being that both sides lost in that war, but there was still a reptilian Draco remnant left on Earth which needed to be quarantined, and a very old, mostly broken Andromedan starship. Remember, Andromedan starships, they're known for their size. The current Andromedan starship, Vieja, a triangular-shaped, hidden behind the moon for much of recent history, we think, as multiple sources report, hundreds of miles in size, very, very huge. Andromedans built huge ships, the blue sphere beings, as David Wilcock would call them. And that was then the port for many of the Pleiadian and other craft of the Federation of Planets. Important part of the story is how recently the Pleiadians got kicked out of the United Federation Planet for reasons which differ between how Swaru reports them via Gosha versus what we hear from other sources, that the Pleiadians got kicked out of the Federation of Planets for being too interventionist. And remember, the Pleiadian craft had the biggest guns around Earth for the longest time, even recently. Now we've been jumping back and forth between the past and the present. When I talk about that Andromedan craft Vieja behind the moon, hidden behind the dark side of the moon, and the hundreds of Pleiadian crafts that only recently left the Earth after killing many millions of reptilian Kingu underground, but then got booted out of the Planetary Federation. And these are, this may sound incredulous, but multiple sources are confirming, including a military source recently confirmed the percentage of human-eating reptilian Kingu underground that were killed. We have separate military source confirming these stories, and the Alpha Draco, which are the huge high Draco, size of dinosaurs almost, were actually helping kill the Kingu who were preying on the humans. So the reason the Pleiadians got kicked out of the United Federation of Planets, they admit that they were trying to be interventionists, and the Federation of Planets didn't agree. But we now know there's more to their story of how the Pleiadians got kicked out. They say, oh, well, we were trying to help humans by being interventionists. And the Federation of Planets said, you were not respecting the sacred freedom of indigenous peoples in the way you were interacting with humans on Earth. And the humans need to get involved in this conversation soon. We're going to need to know what the Pleiadians wanted from the humans, because there's going to be all these sources giving their version of the story. The Anton Parks is the Draco version of the story. The Med and the Swaru and the Gosha version is the Pleiadian version of the story. And they all have agendas. And we need to know what those agendas were. For example, when the Draco genetically modified Greys, Khmer, abducted hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans after the Greada Treaty with Eisenhower, it is reported that over 90% of those abducted were those of some indigenous blood, meaning those who were able to lucid dream. Meaning, does that give you a clue to what they needed from humans? Our value wasn't our technology. No, the value of humans was the ones who could lucid dream had some DNA that was useful to them. Get a clue here, humans. Where is going to be your bargaining chip in this conversation? So, back to our early part of the story. So, a giant ex-Andromedan starship, it was basically a hulk, which we now call the Moon, was installed. And so when Alex Collier says the Andromedans offered to tow away the Moon because it was infected, he didn't quite get the story correctly. Yes, the Moon is infected with Greys, Dracos, and Reptilians, as is Mars. However, there are large populations there, and by the way, real estate there is expensive. So you Earth humans, assuming that you can just move in, you're kidding yourselves. No, you need to bargain, and you're going to need some leverage in the conversation, and that's why we're here. So anyway, the inside the Moon that was installed at that point, remember, it can't be a coincidence that the diameter of the Moon is such that the cone between the Earth and the Sun is perfect. No, obviously the Moon was installed. Nobody disagrees. And it's obviously proven the Moon is hollow and metal. It rang like a bell for like days after they crashed the lunar lander to measure the seismic resonance of the Moon. They were, oh, is the Moon going to ring for a half a second? No, the Moon rang like a metal bell for like days. It's hollow and metal, all right. So what they installed in the Moon was these nuclear generators generating a series of frequencies, and we now know, as Med reports, 50 hertz is one of those key frequencies which we discussed in the last presentation. And the reason that the right key signature frequency generator in the Moon can make a frequency quarantine is because if you interfere with the compression frequencies of a planet related directly to why the Schumann harmonics are phase conjugate to Planck, which is my discovery, which is why Gaia is self-organizing. Lovelock got it right. Gaia is self-aware. The physics of why is called The Origin of Biologic Negentropy, the title of my book, because the power spectra of the Schumann harmonic series closely approximates pure phase conjugate negentropy, charge implosion to Planck. The definition of self-awareness, the origin of non-destructive self-reentry. So, if you mess with those frequencies, the stargates don't work. And how are those Dracos getting around? Hello, this is a beginning of introduction to the quarantine story. At any rate, as Med and others very helpfully explain, I think Med's explanation is better than Gosha's. Excuse me. That those nuclear generators working for thousands of years to keep, first of all, the Draco Greys and Kingu eventually hacked their way out, and the quarantine wasn't working that good anyway. And now those nuclear generators are breaking down. And when the nuclear generators break down, the power spectrum of the Earth's low-frequency, weak, capacitive, coupled harmonic cascade field will become more implosive. And stargates will begin to work better, and more humans will experience lucid dreaming. Literally approaching the Christian story of the rapture. They say the guns will melt during the rapture. The physics is when the harmonic series becomes implosive, everything with the wrong dielectric constant generates heat. And that's why the guns will melt during the rapture. So you do not want to be the left behind, as the Christians would say. Well, in this case, we know exactly the physics of who the left behind were. Those living in metal buildings instead of biologic architecture. Because if you can't charge implode, you can't tune into the DNA radio and the longitudinal grid and da-da-da-da-da-da. That's why one of the reasons now, as the nuclear generators break down in the moon, and they say the Earth will go from 3D to 5D, well, if the Pleiadian is telling you, you know, every other sentence out of Swaru's mouth is, humans are inferior because, it's like every other sentence. I think it's a scream. Well, humans are inferior because we're 3D and they're 5D. Therefore, they're superior and we're inferior. It just goes on and on and on. Of course, a scientist listening to that has to think it's crap because he doesn't have a clue what she means by 5D until I explained it to you that the longitudinal projective field, the fractal field, that when you become longitudinal phase coherent in your aura, lucid dreaming, memory through death, projective geometry, having a soul is all this physics of having a soul, literally. That's when you go from 3D to 5. And when the planet does that, when the rapture comes, then charge propagation efficiency returns. For example, why do the ancestors emerge from their grave as memory plasma during the rapture? Now you know. I just explained it. I hope. Well, we have explained. You understand. So the return of ancestral memory. Now, we're going to get more specific in this story and go into Egyptian. And in the next segment, we're also going to then talk about how the physics of Kundalini, human bliss process, enables humans to make exactly what it is that is their leverage in these conversations. Because obviously now we know the agenda, for example, of the Pleiadians. When I was living with, well, I stayed with Marciniak, Barbara Marciniak, and taught their famous Pleiadian source. And they did these rituals with basically naked women on the serpent mounds. And we wondered why the Pleiadians at that time were encouraging promiscuity. Now we understand much more about this agenda. It's because the Pleiadians have an agenda. They needed something. Pleiadian women, after thousands of generations of not directly nursing their babies, and yes, they didn't have to die because mechanically they eliminated the need for death electrically by artificial means, but they lost the skill of how to die. And that skill is a clue to where their agendas will cause Earth humans to be parasited unless we understand our value in the conversation. And that's where we're going in the next lecture in this series. Thank you very much. fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. I'll put all the lecture notes there.